Recent years have seen a surge in populist rhetoric globally, often marked by emotionally charged anti-elite messaging, and scholars have argued that such rhetoric may erode democratic norms like tolerance, institutional trust, and commitment to pluralism. And the thought here is that the effect goes through an emotional response of populist rhetoric. Now, we think there's a research gap, that while correlational studies suggest a link between populism and democratic backsliding, causal mechanisms have been underexplored. There's limited survey experimental evidence that exists on the direct effects of populist and emotional appeals, but in these survey experimental settings, which we are also attempting in Oxford, I'm not going to say a lot about that today, the primes are confounded by the actual political context. So hence a reason to go into a lab. And we know also that in real contexts, social desirability may be a big concern. So our approach on the lab experiment side of this study was to try and manipulate exposure to populist rhetoric and measure changes in support for democratic norms and certain kinds of behaviors. And then to see whether that operates through the triggering of emotional responses. And the goal is to identify whether emotional appeals are uniquely or politically particularly powerful in weakening certain democratic normative commitments. So in the lab, and I had to learn a lot about labs. I'm not a man who's worked in labs before, so this is very much joint work involving especially Noah Bassine, who ran the lab at Nuffield College, though the experiment didn't take place in Nuffield, and Spiros Kosmidas. So in the lab, we tried to create a society where status may conflict with wealth, and to examine whether populist rhetoric leads players, participants in the lab experiment, to endorse behaviors and policies which run against their particular interests, and then whether they're prepared to endorse an exclusionary democratic and anti-democratic norms, our proxy for illiberalism. And as you'll see, by introducing intergroup competition, we try and recreate social cleavages in the lab. And the social cleavages in the lab are only in the lab, so to speak. We're not imposing differences from the real world, so to speak, but we're trying to get people to divide in important ways that relate to group interests and individual interests within the lab setting itself. And we collect both quantitative and qualitative evidence to test our hypothesis that the populist rhetoric via emotional triggers produces illiberal behaviors. So data collection was at the beginning of March 2025. The sessions lasted approximately 2 hours each. They will have 304 observations in 5 days across 10 experimental sessions. 8 of the sessions had 32 participants. The remaining 2 had 24. It was conducted at the University of Nottingham among students at the University of Nottingham. And as you'll see, the way in which the groups divided was important. Now, the lab experiment, therefore, involves the ability of the participants to make real money that they can take home. They're then exposed to an emotive treatment, and then we try and see whether the emotive treatment affects their preferences about tax policy and about illiberal behaviors. So you can see they have various ways in which they can vote at different points in the process, including on the tax rate, and whether they would choose to spend money to exclude others from having the vote at all, which is our illiberal behavior. And our treated subjects, interestingly, tended to vote against their rational preferences. That is to say, we succeeded with the treatment in getting people to vote against their own interests in their preferences about tax policy. We also managed to get people to have a substantially higher propensity to engage in illiberal behaviors. Okay. They were given a kind of a very basic task. They could earn real money by working on fairly mundane tasks at a computer. Some, of course, do better than others. So there's inequality that's established at the individual level in their performance. And at the different stages of the experiment, they were asked to vote on what the best tax rate will be. And for the most part, they chose a tax rate that matched their individual level performance. That is to say, those earning the most chose low taxes, those earning the least chose a higher tax rate. Then we got them to work in groups on another task where the payoff was significantly lower than it was for their individual work. But it was competitive, and at the end of which we identified the groups as winners or losers. And some of the winners were winners who were also individually doing well. Some of the losers were also those individuals who were losing. But you can see in the middle there are cross-pressured people. And so you have low status taxpayers, that's low status people who want low taxes, and so on. At a certain point, we then subjected about half of the participants to a highly charged emotional rhetoric that emphasized their group identity and that strongly suggested that their group is being treated unfairly by other groups. And this is the treatment. The system is rigged, and they want to keep it that way so you never have a fair chance of success. They call it fair, but we all know the truth. The system is broken, and it's time for, and then we identify a particular group as winners or losers that people know they belong to take action. Here is your chance to change how the next vote works. You and the other winners or losers have the power to ensure that your voice is heard, no more being silenced. So this was the populist rhetoric that we subjected them to. Then we checked to make sure that it produced an emotional response. And here's just one example, that it made people angry, right? They don't deserve, this is obviously a winner, they don't deserve to dictate their wildly unfair tax rate, forcing those who are successful in society to be punished. They're running an authoritarian state, and I believe we need to change. Our group worked and communicated well. We deserve to make the decisions, for it is proportionately our money they're taking due to their low effort. Now, what we found is that those in the non-cross-pressure group did not alter their tax preferences as a result of the treatment. But what we managed to do was get those people in the cross-pressure group, in particular, to vote for things that were based on their group identities, even if it went against their immediately self-interested individual preferences about tax. So the treatment via anger appears to work. Moreover, the treatment led to people across the board in each of our groups being willing to support and indeed use their money to support exclusionary behaviors with about who could vote and effectively to disenfranchise people. And you can see, although there was an effect across the board, that is to say, even those who weren't treated were willing to spend a bit of money to exclude others, the rate at which they did it increases really dramatically in these circumstances. So the outcomes showed that participants in some of the groups, particularly those that were cross-pressured, that received the emotionally charged rhetoric were more likely to vote for tax rates that were contrary to their individual interests. Those who were subject to the rhetoric were much more likely to use their money to suppress the vote. And the participants who were treated with the emotional rhetoric were more likely to be angry. Now, in 4 minutes that I have left, let's return to, as it were, so what? Right, we're interested in liberalism here. So one possible implication is, if we think as liberals that improving material incentives on its own will be sufficient to overcome group grievances, the lab experiment doesn't really speak to that. Right? It's not just about improving economic outcomes for individuals, because they can be manipulated by certain kinds of rhetoric to prefer outcomes that hurt themselves and disenfranchise other groups, even if they lose out themselves. So one thing we might say is, it might be good if emotional rhetoric was cooled down and that reason and rationality prevailed. It's a dangerous thing because it might leave emotionality just for illiberals to use or populists to use. And therefore, we might think it could be a failed sort of strategy. Now, I've got a lot of things about here. There's probably far too much in 2 minutes and 41 seconds. What then should liberals be doing? Right? Now, maybe I'm a kind of a left populist. Right? So when I look back on our treatment, everything is rigged and it's unfair, I certainly have myself considerable sympathy for that perspective. Now, left populism is one kind of alternative to mobilize the emotionality of unfairness about a distinctive or other particular kind of economic form of inequality. But it may not be the only way of identifying and mobilizing group identities, and that among the multiple kinds of group identities that may be available to liberals, there may be alternatives or complementary ways of identifying groups to just those that are identified by left populists. So can liberal actors identify alternative group loyalties and entities that challenge the group narratives that illiberal populists are using? So we can be angry, but angry about other unfairnesses about groups who are being negatively affected by illiberalism or illiberal appeals. So among things we might say, could emotional appeals to fairness in citizenship, and indeed fairness about notions of our common humanity, be a way of winning support by triggering an emotional response as well, even from those people who are currently being triggered by particularly populist, illiberal kinds of appeals that we dislike? So how do we get back onto a kind of level playing field where we can use group loyalty and emotional appeals in ways that make sense for liberals? And as my time is up, I will stop there. I will stop only by mentioning that there is an additional element to what we've done in Oxford, which involves the survey experiments. The results, the fieldwork literally concluded earlier this week. What we have found so far, very preliminary analysis, is that we can make people angry in a survey experiment as well. What we now need to see is how much effect we can have on their propensities to be illiberal or become more liberal by the different ways in which we treat them emotionally. I'll stop at that.